Hello everyone. My name is Dr. Yonit Arthur. I'm an audiologist and coach. You are on The Steady Coach, and today we're going to be talking about all the myths surrounding chronic dizziness recovery and get to the bottom of what the truth actually is about chronic dizziness recovery. Before we jump into it, if you're brand new to my channel, first of all, welcome. So glad to have you here. Be sure to subscribe so that you get notified when I release new videos. But you may also be totally overwhelmed by the amount of content I have on my channel. On top of that, you may be dealing with chronic dizziness yourself or have a loved one who's dealing with chronic dizziness, and it can be really difficult to make sense of just the wide array of information I have on my channel. So please pause the video here and sign up for the free course first. It is completely free and it will walk you through in a more organized way how to use the videos on my channel and how to actually put them into practice to recover from chronic dizziness. You can find a link in the video description below or go to my website, thesteadycoach.com/free-course to sign up. Again, totally free. Now, we're going to jump into the myths, and by far the biggest myth about chronic dizziness recovery is that it can't be done. If you Google, and I very strongly suggest that you not Google, PPPD MdDS, vestibular migraine, chronic subjective dizziness, and many of these other symptom-based diagnoses that basically just describe you having chronic dizziness but don't actually say why you have chronic dizziness, you will see that in most of the mainstream medical field, you're going to be told you can't recover, that these symptoms can only be managed or that you can learn to cope with them. Now, I am medically trained. I am a licensed audiologist. I'm board certified. I'm also trained and certified in vestibular therapy, but I simply don't agree with the conclusions that the mainstream medical community has reached on these. And here are just a few of the reasons why. First of all, these conditions, in particular PPPD and vestibular migraine, are relatively new diagnoses. Yes, we've had similar syndromes through the years. People have probably been having chronic dizziness symptoms since humanity came to be. So I'm not saying the symptoms are new, but the research around these symptoms and the research around these specific diagnoses and the treatments needed to help someone recover from them, those are all still fairly new, last 10, maybe 20 years. So I think it's an incredible leap of judgment and actually quite arrogant and harmful, which I'll get to in a moment, to tell people, based on a very small amount of evidence over a very short period of time in which we've been actually doing quality research on this, we have now concluded you can't recover from this, you're stuck with it forever, good luck. This brings me to that second point, the fact that this causes so much harm to people. As I'm going to discuss a little bit more in depth later in this video, PPPD, MdDS, vestibular migraine, and these other chronic dizziness conditions are very often neural circuit problems, meaning they're software problems. They're problems in how the brain is processing information, but they don't reflect a permanent tissue damage or disease process. So for us to conclude that these conditions can't be treated at all when mainstream medicine really doesn't quite understand how they even come about, again, doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And furthermore, since these are neural circuit problems that, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many others in my field, are being driven by fear, anxiety, worries, and stress, when we tell people that they can't recover, there is no greater danger signal that I could possibly give someone. I'm essentially putting a belief into that person's head that recovery is not possible. And I really don't see a scenario in which that's helpful for someone. I'm not saying that people shouldn't learn how to cope and manage with symptoms when they have them, but for me to then decree based on not great evidence and not many years of evidence, and the fact that there are actually people who recover, and I've interviewed a lot of them, to me, it seems that it causes a lot of harm. So that's why I wanted to start this video with this one. if you're here, whether you're new or you're not, you can recover from medically unexplained chronic dizziness. You can recover from neural circuit dizziness. The idea that you can't recover and that you're only going to be managing or living with symptoms is simply a myth. And if you need more evidence for that, please visit the Success Stories playlist on my channel. You will hear from real people just like you who have recovered and are living their lives normally. This brings me to the second myth, which is pretty closely related to the first, that the only way to manage these symptoms, which again, I've already said I believe is kind of a myth, is to do so biomedically through medications, physical therapy, and other physical kinds of treatments. Now, I think the reason we ended up with this whole idea of just coping with or managing symptoms in the first place is because physicians are looking at medically unexplained chronic dizziness through a biomedical lens. So a biomedical lens means what we're looking for when someone comes in with a symptom is a biological disease process or problem that needs to be treated in order for the person to feel better. In the case of neural circuit dizziness, very often there isn't one. Maybe there was one, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But right now, the doctor is going to look at you and say, you know, I know there's a sensory processing issue in there because you're clearly dizzy, but there doesn't seem to be any explanation for why you have it. So from that assumption, a medical professional can go one of two ways. That person may say, okay, well, this means since there isn't a problem, the only thing we can do is manage it. And in medical terms or in the medical world, that means using medications to reduce symptoms. Or the medical professional is going to say, aha, I know why you're having this problem. It's because you're having this problem. And so we're going to treat the problem, and that's going to solve the problem. If that was confusing, let me illustrate. In many cases, for example, mal de Barkmont syndrome, or MdDS, is treated as the actual symptoms themselves. So someone who has mal de Barkmont syndrome is dealing with constant rocking, bobbing, and swaying. Sometimes this is brought on by passive motion, like a boat ride, and sometimes it just happens spontaneously. And in the conventional treatment paradigm, the doctor says, okay, the reason that you're having the rocking, bobbing, and swaying is because your brain is interpreting things wrong and leading to rocking, bobbing, and swaying. Therefore, the rocking, bobbing, and swaying are really the problem, so we need to treat that. And we need to treat the fact that your brain is misinterpreting information. That is true, technically that is true, but no one's really asking or answering the question, why is someone's brain interpreting information the way that it is? Why does someone with MdDS have this issue in which their brain persistently misinterprets sensory information and makes you think you're moving when you're not? So then medical professionals will prescribe physical therapy or medications to help deal with the symptom problem that they're describing without ever really wondering why someone's brain would do this in the first place. And this is where the idea of neural circuit dizziness comes in, because neural circuit dizziness says, yes, all that's happening, the brain is producing symptoms, and the symptoms are feeding back into the brain, and the brain is producing more symptoms. But what neural circuit dizziness is saying, that more conventional or more mainstream approaches aren't, is that fear, anxiety, stress, traumatic experiences, these things are feeding that cycle, that those are the things that help keep the brain stuck. So in short, in my opinion, and again, in my pretty extensive experience at this point, while I'm not saying I'm against biomedical treatments for neural circuit dizziness symptoms, and medications can be very helpful in helping people kind of get over the hump so they can do the other work, the actual work we need to do is not biomedical. It has to do with emotions and thoughts and feelings. And so therefore, biomedical treatments aren't necessarily what you need. The third myth, and this is something I'm so excited to talk about for many of you here, the third myth is that if you had tissue damage that originally started your symptoms, that's why you still have them. So shout out to all of you who've had neuritis or labyrinthitis. You may have heard many different terms describe this: unilateral vestibulopathy, unilateral hypofunction. All of these describe pretty much the same process that says that one of your ears has been damaged in some way for some reason. This can be because of a virus, a tumor, a growth, a head injury, all sorts of other things. Sometimes it just happens and we don't know why. And yes, having a weak ear does cause dizziness. The reason it causes dizziness is because your brain perceives balance using something called predictive coding, which basically means it is predicting how movement is going to go, and then it's just using your senses to confirm what's really happening. Now, I go into a lot more detail on this in a different video, so if you want more information about this one, please see the video linked in the video description on neural circuit dizziness basics. But essentially what this means is that when you knock out one ear, the brain's predictions are going to be wildly off. The brain's going to be like, hey, in this situation, normally I get this kind of information from the ear, but now I'm getting this. What does this even mean? Oh my gosh, I'm so dizzy and disoriented. This typically lasts, depending on the cause, for a few months. And it really does get better with vestibular rehabilitation therapy. However, once someone has gone through vestibular rehabilitation therapy and has had dizziness for more than a few months, that initial ear weakness or injury doesn't really explain why that person still has symptoms. Because for the typical person, that symptom resolves within that period of time due to a process called brain compensation. It's how your brain essentially realizes, okay, this ear is now weaker than it used to be, and it recalibrates. That's what it normally does. If it doesn't do that, in my opinion, at this point, we're dealing with a neural circuit problem. It is a brain problem, a sensory processing problem in the brain, a software issue, and software issues can be addressed using the methods that I talk about everywhere else on my channel. So, long story short, if tissue damage started your symptoms, it is not necessarily what is keeping your symptoms going now, and you can still recover from chronic dizziness symptoms even if you had tissue damage or injury. There are others on the Success Stories playlist who have done that, and I have worked personally with many clients whose issues started with permanent ear damage and who now no longer have symptoms, even though the ear damage was permanent and isn't going anywhere. That brings me to the next myth, which is that all dizziness has to start with some kind of medical problem. Many of you are new to my channel and very understandably super freaked out by the dizziness symptoms. And you are absolutely correct in that your first stops need to be at various medical professionals to make sure there's nothing physically wrong that explains your symptoms. That all being said, in many, many, many cases, there is nothing physically wrong that started your symptoms. And I'll talk about some of my theories about how this happens or why, but suffice it to say here that you may not have had any kind of medical issue. Dizziness can just spontaneously happen. And what that means for you is once you're medically cleared by your doctors, you probably have neural circuit dizziness, even if there wasn't a medical problem that explains why you originally had it. Now, how does this happen? Well, it's kind of going back to what I said a little bit earlier. Brains operate through something called predictive coding. My brain has to decide what it thinks might happen, and then it has to do a really good job of comparing what it gets from the senses to its predictions to make me feel balanced. Brains make mistakes. Brains make a lot of mistakes. Think about the last time you were in a car and the car next to you started driving a little faster than you were, and you couldn't tell if you were moving or they were moving. There are lots of situations where the information from your senses is unclear or ambiguous, meaning it could mean multiple things, and your brain makes a mistake in its interpretation. If things are going relatively okay, your brain will just correct the bad prediction and you will move on with your life. But when your brain is set up to be overly sensitive when the volume dial on danger signals is cranked up, which can happen for many reasons, but it can be stress, anxiety, trauma, emotional factors, social isolation, feeling bad about yourself, etc. When that sensitivity to danger is cranked up, your brain is going to over-respond to dizziness that happens, or ambiguity, meaning unclear information from your balance system, in an overreactive way. And when that happens, you feel more dizzy. And then you feel more anxious because you're more dizzy. And then you feel more dizzy because you're more anxious, and then you got it where I'm going with this, right? It gets you into the chronic dizziness cycle. So if you're out there, and especially if you're still at the beginning of your journey and you're like, the doctors can't find anything wrong with me, I want you to know, for many people viewing my channel, at least half of you, there's nothing wrong with you. This was simply a brain misprediction in response to either a normal dizziness sensation or a temporary blip in how your nervous system or vestibular system are working. And that's what's keeping chronic dizziness symptoms going, even if there's no medical issue at all. And finally, I want to set the record straight on this. The last myth we're going to talk about is dizziness is not just anxiety. And I know that you're going to hear differing opinions on this in the neuroplasticity or neural circuit world, but I want to be very clear about this. When you have chronic dizziness, the symptoms are not just in your head, you're not just anxious, they are 100% real. Your brain is having trouble processing sensory information. It is not doing a good job of understanding what information from your eyes, ears, and sense of touch are telling it. Now, the underlying issue that's causing that processing problem can be psychological things, can be physical stress, can be a whole array of things. But the processing problem itself is not just anxiety. Now, I do want to say here, of course, we do know from research that people with pre-existing anxiety or anxiety disorders are much more likely to develop chronic symptoms after having an initial dizziness symptom. So anxiety certainly plays a role here, and it is certainly playing a role for many of you for many reasons, including that dizziness itself causes anxiety. So many of you are trapped in an anxiety cycle. But I just want you to know that dizziness, chronic dizziness, regardless of which diagnosis you have, is not just a psychological problem. It truly is a problem in how your brain is using your balance system. That all being said, it is still a software problem. It is still being driven by factors that are things you can work on to get better from, and you can still recover from it. I hope this was helpful, helped clear the air of some of these myths. I look forward to hearing your questions and comments. Please drop them below. I love hearing from you. Please also like this video, share it if you enjoyed it. Please also subscribe to my channel. All of these things help me reach more people. Looking forward to seeing you next time. We'll talk to you soon. Bye.